At around 8 p.m. on December 16, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, and Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends and he had had a couple of drinks. He didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, and so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. He pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip, but then as he puts the drink back down, he's keeping his eyes on the road. He hits something with the drink, and instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder, and then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road, and so at full speed he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and flips up and over the back of his car, and so he just pulled off the side of the road. He looked over his shoulder. The road was clear. There was no deer, but Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. Nestor came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck, but when he reached for his phone was dead. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there. But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor. He turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car. He begins to feel really sleepy. He eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle. The officer said, "Get out of the car." The officer just says to Nestor, "What's going on here?" He turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. And then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. The officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it. And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at, and when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk. And when he was driving on the highway, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated.